The grass was taller than the children. That was the first thing Edna Hargrove noticed when she climbed down from the wagon on the first day of August 1887. The grass grew past her waist, past her chest, in some places bending and swaying in a wind that never stopped, a wind that came from somewhere beyond the edge of the world and kept going as if it had somewhere important to be. The grass moved like water, like an ocean she had crossed once 31 years ago on a ship that smelled of vomit and prayers. She was 62 years old. Her knees ached when she stepped down from the wagon bed. Her lower back seized for a moment, a familiar pain, an old companion that had lived in her spine for the better part of a decade. She steadied herself against the wagon wheel and looked at the land. 160 acres of Nebraska prairie stretched in every direction. No house, no well, no fence, no broken ground. Nothing but grass as high as a man's shoulder, running uninterrupted until the earth curved away and the sky swallowed everything whole. This was the claim. This was what her son had left her. Raymond Hargrove had filed on this land 6 months earlier. He had paid the $18 fee at the land office in town, signed his name on the paperwork, and built nothing. Not a shed, not a lean-to, not even a fire ring. He had looked at 160 acres of free land and seen something worth claiming, but nothing worth working for. That was Raymond. That had always been Raymond. 3 weeks ago, he had taken the draft horse. He had taken $42 in savings money Edna had earned washing other people's clothes, mending other people's shirts, scrubbing other people's floors on hands and knees that were already old and already hurting. He had taken the future they were supposed to build together on this land, the house, the well, the garden, the life. He had ridden east without a word of explanation, without a word of farewell, without looking back at his mother or his children or anything he was leaving behind. What remained fit in the wagon bed? 2 children, a cast-iron cook stove that weighed more than Edna did, bedding for 3, kitchen implements, a shovel with a cracked handle, an axe, a handsaw, enough dried corn and salt pork to last perhaps a month if she was careful, perhaps 3 weeks if she was honest. The wagon itself was not hers. The horse that had pulled it was borrowed from a family 20 miles east who expected it returned within the week. When that horse left, Edna Hargrove would be standing on 160 acres of grass with 2 small children and no way to move anything heavier than she could carry in her own arms. She looked at her hands. They were the hands of a woman who had worked every day of her life since the age of 9. Thick knuckles, skin roughened by lye soap in winter cold, and decades of labor that never ended because poverty never took a day off. These hands had scrubbed, sewn, kneaded, hauled, wrung, and lifted since before Nebraska was a word she knew. They were strong hands. They were old hands. They were all she had. Rudy stood beside her. He was 6 years old, her grandson Raymond's son. He held his sister's hand the way he always did, with the quiet grip of a child who understood that holding on was important even when he did not understand why. He had his father's jaw and his grandmother's silence. He watched the prairie with eyes that did not belong on a 6-year-old face. They were careful eyes, measuring eyes, the eyes of someone who had already learned that adults could not always be trusted to keep the world from falling apart. Lenny was 4. She had her father's pale eyes and her grandmother's stillness. She was watching a grasshopper navigate the stems near her feet with the total concentration that only very young children can sustain. She did not ask where they would sleep tonight. She did not ask where her father had gone. She had learned in the way that small children learn things they should never have to learn, that some questions did not have answers worth hearing. The wagon would be their home. Edna understood this immediately. The canvas top had a tear along one seam that would let rain through when rain came. But it was August. The rains would hold off for now. She had time. Time for what exactly she did not yet know. That first night after the children fell asleep on the straw bedding in the wagon, Edna sat on the ground and looked at the sky. The stars in Nebraska were different from the stars in Saxony. Not different stars, she supposed, but more of them. So many more that the sky itself seemed to glow a pale wash of light, stretching from horizon to horizon, and she felt very small beneath it. Very old, very alone. She was German-born. She had come to America in 1856, 31 years old, on a ship full of families who believed the stories about free land and fresh starts. She could not read English. She could not write it. She signed documents with an X, the same mark her mother had made on papers in Saxony, before the family decided to cross an ocean for a life that was supposed to be better than the one they had. Her mother had died believing America was a place where work was rewarded. Edna was 62 and no longer certain that was true. But she was certain about one thing: she was not going to die on this prairie, and her grandchildren were not going to die beside her. That was not a plan, that was not a strategy. It was just a decision made in the dark under stars she could not name on land she did not yet know how to hold. But it was hers, and it was enough to keep her sitting upright when everything in her body wanted to lie down and give up. The neighbor arrived on the third day. Oscar Brandt was 54 years old, German-born like Edna, with a beard that had gone white at the edges and hands that looked like they had been carved from the root of an old oak tree. He had homesteaded in Custer County in 1878, 9 winters on the Nebraska plains. He had survived all of them, though the winters had taken things from him that would never grow back. 2 toes on his left foot, the hearing in his right ear, a way of laughing that his wife said he used to have before the blizzard of '81, but that she could no longer remember the sound of. He had helped build more than 20 sod houses, always with crews of 3 or 4 men, always with horse and a breaking plow to cut the sod into proper strips. He knew what it took to survive out here because he had paid the price of that knowledge in flesh and frost and years of labor that bent his back and thickened his hands and taught him that the prairie did not care about courage or determination or any of the things that people back east that like to put in newspaper stories about the frontier. He rode up to Edna's wagon in the late afternoon. He dismounted slowly the way old men do when their knees carry memories of every cold morning and every hard landing and every long day spent walking behind a plow. He studied the empty claim, the 2 small children playing in the grass, the old woman standing alone beside a coal cook stove. "You are the wife," he said. It was not a question. In Custer County, news traveled faster than weather. "I am the mother," Edna said. "The wife was someone else. She died when Rudy was 2. Oscar absorbed this. The boy was watching him with the wariness that children develop when the adults in their lives have failed them too many times. He was not afraid of Oscar. He was afraid of what Oscar might say. Because Rudy was 6 years old and he already understood that words spoken by serious men in serious voices usually meant that something bad was about to happen. Lenny had found another grasshopper. She was following it through the stems with her finger extended, narrating its journey in a soft mixture of German and English that made sense only to her. She was oblivious to the conversation about survival happening 10 feet away. She was 4. The world was still full of grasshoppers. "You cannot build a house alone," Oscar said. "Not a frame house, not a sod house, not any house." He paused. The words came harder now. He was not a man who enjoyed saying difficult things, but he was a man who believed that difficult things needed to be said. "You should sell this acclaim for whatever you can get. $20, maybe 30. Use the money to travel east before September ends. Find a situation, a household that needs a cook or a laundress, somewhere with walls already built." Edna said nothing. "If you stay," Oscar continued, "you will need to build. If you try to build alone, you will fail. If you fail, winter will come anyway." He looked at the children one more time. Rudy had stopped watching him. The boy was looking at his grandmother instead, reading her face the way children read faces when they cannot yet read words. A woman alone cannot cut sod-raised walls and set a ridgepole before the cold comes. You will freeze in that half-built hovel, and your grandchildren will freeze beside you. The words hung in the air between them. Edna felt them land. She felt their weight. She did not flinch. Oscar mounted his horse. He gathered the reins and looked down at her from the saddle, and his face held something that was not pity exactly, but was close enough to pity that it burned. "I have seen it before," he said. "Newcomers who think the prairie is kind. The prairie is not kind, Mrs. Hargrove. It takes everything you have, and then it takes what you do not have. Sell the claim. Go east. Do not let pride kill your grandchildren." He rode away without looking back. He believed he was saving her life by being honest. He believed that the truth delivered plainly was the greatest kindness he could offer. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had buried neighbors, who had seen children pulled from frozen houses in March with skin the color of candle wax, who had learned in 9 Nebraska winters that hope without resources was just a slower way to die. Edna stood beside the wagon and watched him disappear into the grass. The sound of his horse faded. The wind filled the space where his words had been. Rudy came and stood next to her. He did not ask what the old man had said. He had heard enough. "Grandma," he said quietly, "what are we going to do?" Edna looked at the empty prairie. She looked at the wagon that was not hers. She looked at her grandson, who was 6 years old and already carried the weight of understanding that the world did not offer second chances to people like them. People without money, people without men, people whose own family had looked at them and decided they were not worth staying for. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the most honest answer she had, an honesty she believed was something she owed these children. They had been lied to enough. Their father had lied to them every day he stayed, pretending he would be there tomorrow, and then one morning he was gone. Edna would not lie. She would not promise what she could not deliver. She would not say everything will be fine when everything was very far from fine, but she would not say it was over either, because she did not believe it was over. Not yet. Not while she could still stand. Not while her hands still worked. Not while there was grass under her feet and dirt beneath the grass and the faintest, most stubborn ember of something burning in her chest that she could not name but refused to let go out. 3 days later, Edna walked the claim with her grandchildren beside her. She had spent those 3 days counting their food, enough dried corn and salt pork for perhaps 3 weeks if she cut her own portions and gave the larger shares to the children. She told herself she was not hungry. Her stomach disagreed, but her stomach had been overruled before and would be overruled again. Counting the distance to town. A full day's walk each direction, 8 miles through grass that grabbed at her skirts and hid the gopher holes that could snap an ankle. Counting the weeks until the first hard freeze. 12, maybe 14, if the weather held. If the weather was kind, and the weather in Nebraska was never kind, counting the money. $2.60. Enough for almost nothing. The numbers did not add up to survival. Oscar Brandt was right about that. She could not afford lumber. She could not afford hired labor. She could not afford a horse or a plow or any of the tools that turned impossible work into merely difficult work. But as she walked, she noticed something. The grass beneath her feet was thick. Not just thick, dense, matted. The roots wove together beneath the surface like rope, like the braided rugs her mother used to make from scraps of old cloth, each strand useless alone, but together forming something that could bear weight. When Edna knelt, feeling the familiar protest in her knees, the grinding complaint of joints that had knelt 10,000 times on hard floors and frozen ground, she pushed her fingers into the soil and felt those roots gripping the earth in a single mass. She pulled. A chunk of sod came up intact, trailing dirt but refusing to crumble, holding together the way things hold together when they have been connected for a long time, when the bonds between them are older and stronger than any single force trying to pull them apart. She remembered her father. Before the immigration, before America, before Nebraska was even a sound her mouth could make. Her father Heinrich had built a root cellar in Saxony by cutting blocks of earth from a hillside and stacking them like stones. The cellar had lasted 20 years. The walls never shifted. The earth held itself together because the roots held the earth and the earth held the roots, and together they made something that neither could make alone. Edna looked at the sod in her hands, 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick. It weighed perhaps 40 pounds, less than a sack of flour, less than Lenny when the child fell asleep after supper and had to be carried to the wagon and tucked into blankets that smelled of grass and dust and the particular sweetness of a 4-year-old's hair. She could lift 40 pounds. She had been lifting 40 pounds and more her entire life. Wash tubs full of wet clothes, cast iron kettles, sacks of grain, children and then grandchildren. 62 years of lifting had not made her weak. It had made her slow. It had made her careful. It had made her bones ache in ways that younger people could not imagine. But it had not taken the strength from her arms or the stubbornness from her spine. The question was not whether she could lift 40 pounds. The question was whether she could lift it enough times. That night, after Rudy and Lenny fell asleep in the wagon, Edna sat on the ground beside the cold cook stove and drew figures in the dirt with a stick. A standard sod house was 14 feet by 16 feet, walls 2 feet thick, 7 feet tall. She did not know exactly how many bricks that required, but she knew the number was enormous. Too many for one person to cut, haul, and stack before the first freeze. Certainly too many for a 62-year-old woman with a cracked shovel and no horse. But what if the house was smaller? She erased the figures with her palm and started again. 10 feet by 12 feet, barely larger than the wagon bed, barely large enough for a stove and a bed, and three people who did not mind living close together. The walls would be the same thickness, 2 feet, because Edna understood instinctively that the thickness mattered even if she could not have explained why. But what if she dug down first, 2 feet below the surface? A pit, a foundation. Then the walls only needed to rise 5 feet above that excavation, not 7. The prairie itself would provide the first 2 feet of protection. Earth on all sides below the ground line, holding warmth in winter and coolness in summer, the way cellars always had, the way her father's root cellar had held the temperature of the earth itself regardless of what the sky was doing above. Smaller house, shorter walls, fewer bricks. A standard house needed 300 bricks, maybe more. Her house might need 180, still an enormous number, still more than any reasonable person would attempt alone, but less impossible than before. And less impossible was all she needed. She did not need easy. She did not need likely. She just needed not impossible. The ridgepole was the other problem. Oscar had said it took 3 strong men. Edna had seen enough barn raisings and house buildings in her years to know he was not exaggerating. A single beam spanning 10 or 12 feet, heavy enough to support a sod roof, weighted down with snow. That beam could weigh 200 pounds or more. One woman could not lift that. One young man could not lift that. The physics of it were absolute. But what if there was no single beam? Edna thought about the willow trees growing along the creek 3/4 of a mile south. She had seen them on her walk. Thin, flexible poles 6 to 8 feet long, each weighing perhaps 15 pounds. One pole was useless for a ridge beam. It would bend and snap under the weight of an odd roof like a twig under a boot heel. But 3 poles lashed together with rope bound tight, twisted around each other until they formed a single bundled beam. 3 thin poles she could lift. 3 thin poles that together might hold what none of them could hold alone. Like the roots in the sod. Useless alone, unbreakable together. The plan took shape in the darkness. Scratched into Nebraska dirt with a stick, erased and redrawn, calculated and recalculated, adjusted and readjusted, until the numbers almost made sense. Almost. The margins were so thin they barely existed. 1 week of bad weather could destroy her. 1 injury could end everything. 1 miscalculation in the wall height or the brick count or the timing of the first freeze could turn her small house into exactly what Oscar had predicted, a half-built hovel where an old woman and 2 children died waiting for a spring that came too late. But almost was enough, almost was more than she had yesterday. Rudy appeared beside her. He had climbed out of the wagon without making a sound, the way children learn to move quietly when the adults around them are carrying burdens that loud noises might cause to fall. He sat down in the dirt next to his grandmother and looked at the figures she had drawn. He could not read numbers any more than she could read English, but he understood the shapes. Rectangles, lanes, the outline of something that might become walls. He did not speak. He just sat beside her in the dark looking at the dirt, and Edna felt something shift in her chest. Not hope. Something older than hope. Something that had no name in German or in English, but that lived in the space between a grandmother and a grandson, sitting together on the ground, drawing the shape of survival in the dirt, while the stars burned overhead, and the prairie wind carried the smell of grass and distance and everything they stood to lose. Marta Pfeiffer arrived 2 days later with a basket of eggs and a loaf of bread. She was 38 years old, the wife of Willem Pfeiffer, mother of 4 children, who had survived infancy on the Nebraska prairie, which was not something every mother could say. She lived 2 miles north in a frame house her husband had built with the help of 3 neighbors. A proper house with glass windows and a wooden floor, and walls made of lumber shipped from Iowa at a cost that Marta never spoke aloud because the number still made her stomach tighten. She had heard about the old woman on the Hargrove claim. Everyone had. News of an abandoned grandmother with 2 small grandchildren and no money and no horse and no help was the kind of story that traveled through frontier communities the way fire travels through dry grass, fast and impossible to contain. Trading, Marta said when she handed Edna the basket. For some mending you might do later. It was not trading, they both knew it. But frontier charity required the pretense of exchange, the fiction that generosity was commerce, because accepting charity meant admitting defeat, and admitting defeat on the prairie was the first step toward actual defeat. Edna accepted the fiction along with the food. Marta walked the claim with Edna and listened to the plan. The small dimensions, the dug-down foundation, the bundled ridge poles instead of a single beam. When Edna finished explaining, Marta was quiet for a long moment. "It is half the size of any dwelling in the county," she said finally. "It only needs to keep 3 people alive. You will need at least 100 trips hauling sod from the cutting site to the building site. You have no wagon, no sledge, just a canvas tarp." "I know. The roof poles will need supports, rafters, brush for the underlayer beneath the sow." "I know." Marta paused. "What happens if you get sick? If one of the children gets sick, there is no one to finish the work." Edna did not argue. Marta's concerns were real. Every single one of them could kill her. Sickness, injury, weather. The simple mathematics of too much work and not enough time, and a body that was 62 years old and already running on less food than it needed. "I have no other choice," Edna said. "If I don't try, we lose the claim and freeze anyway. If I try and fail, at least we freeze in a place that might have been home." Marta looked at the empty prairie, at the 2 children playing near the wagon, at the woman who was already sunburned across her nose and forehead, already developing calluses on palms that had been calloused before, but were now building new calluses on top of old ones. A woman who had been digging a foundation for 3 days with a broken shovel alone at 62, and who showed no sign of stopping. "I can lend you a spade," Marta said, "a better one than that broken thing you have been using." "I will take it. I cannot lend you a horse. We need both for harvest." "I understand." Marta reached into her basket and pulled out a small jar of lard. "For your hands," she said. "The blisters will crack open if you don't treat them. I have seen women lose the use of their fingers from infections that started with cracked blisters. Rub this in every night. Wrap your hands in cloth when you sleep." She rode home that evening and told her husband about the old woman on the Hargrove claim. Willem Pfeiffer shook his head slowly and said what men always said about ventures they believed were doomed. "She will give up by September. They always do." But Marta was not certain. She had seen something in Edna Hargrove's face that she could not easily describe. Not confidence. Confidence was for people who believed things would work out. This was something harder, something that lived closer to the bone. The look of a person who had already accepted that she might die and had decided to work anyway. Not because she believed she would succeed, but because the alternative was to sit in a borrowed wagon and wait for the cold to come and take her grandchildren while she watched. "That woman will either prove us all wrong," Marta said to her husband, "or she will prove us right. Either way, we will know by January." 2 weeks into the construction, Edna walked into town. It was a full day's journey each way, 8 miles through grass and heat, carrying nothing on the way there and carrying hope on the way back. She left before dawn, walking in the gray light, feeling the dew soak through her boots and the cool air settle against her skin like a damp cloth. Rudy stayed with Lenny at the claim. He was 6. He could manage his sister for a day. He had managed worse. The town sat at the end of a single dirt road. A general store, a land office, a blacksmith, the optimistic beginnings of a settlement that might become something someday if enough people survived long enough to build it. The general store was owned by Elroy Tate. He was 45 years old, American-born, with the soft hands of a man who had never cut sod or hauled water or done anything that left marks on his palms. He had come to Nebraska not to farm, but to sell things to farmers. He owned the store. He also held mortgages on several claims in the county and had acquired 3 failed homesteads in the past 2 years through foreclosures that he described as unfortunate but necessary. Elroy Tate was interested in land the way some men are interested in horses or machinery. Always calculating value, always watching for weakness, always patient, because patience on the frontier was the most profitable virtue a man could possess. The weak left. The strong stayed. And the land the weak left behind could be acquired for pennies on the dollar by a man who knew how to wait. He had heard about the Hargrove claim. He had heard about the old woman. He had done the arithmetic in his head and arrived at a number that pleased him. Edna entered the store with $2.60 in her pocket and a list in her head that was exactly one item long. Window glass. Nothing else. Nails if she could afford them after the glass, but the glass came first because a house without a window was a grave with furniture. She found the panes stacked against the back wall, small rectangles of glass that would let light into a structure that did not yet exist. She selected one, 8 inches by 12 inches, $1.12 according to the hand-lettered sign. Mrs. Hargrove, Elroy said from behind the counter. He pronounced her name with the flat American vowels that always made German names sound like they had been ironed. I heard about your situation. Edna brought the window pane to the counter and counted out $1.12. This left her with $1.48. She placed the coins on the wood surface and pushed them across each one a small surrender, each one a piece of the almost nothing she had left. I heard you are building out there, Elroy continued watching her count. By yourself. Edna waited for her glass. People are talking, saying you are building a child's playhouse. 10 by 12, they say. She did not respond. A house that size will not hold heat, Mrs. Hargrove. Will not hold a family either. Not through a Nebraska winter. Elroy picked up the coins slowly, one at a time, as if counting her future along with her money. His fingers were clean. His nails were trimmed. He had never held a sod brick in his life, and he never would. I could take that claim off your hands. $20. Match. That is more than you will have if you freeze out there. $20 would get you to Omaha. Maybe farther. Edna waited for her glass. I have seen women in your situation before. He wrapped the pane in brown paper, taking his time smoothing the creases with those soft, clean hands. Pride keeps them working until the cold takes their fingers, their children, their lives. I do not say this to be unkind. I say this because I have watched it happen, and I would rather buy your land now at a fair price than watch another family die on a claim that was never going to work. Anna took the wrapped glass from the counter. She held it carefully the way you hold something that costs more than you could afford and means more than its price. $1.12 worth of light, purchased with money she could not spare, for a house that everyone said would fail. She did not thank him. She walked out of the store and into the harsh sunlight and began the long walk back to her claim. 8 miles of grass and dust and silence, carrying a piece of the future in her hands. Behind her, Elroy Tate watched through the store window. His face showed nothing. The dirt she had dug out was piled beside the pit in a mound that Rudy had claimed as a fortress, and Lenny had claimed as a mountain, and that Edna had claimed as evidence that she was making progress, however slow, however painful, however unlikely anyone else believed that progress to be. She climbed down into the pit. The earth was cool here, 2 feet below the surface, insulated from the August heat. She pressed her hand flat against the wall of the excavation and felt the temperature of the ground itself steady and unchanging, indifferent to the season. In winter, this same earth would be warmer than the air above it. She knew this because she remembered her father's root cellar. She knew it because the earth had taught her long ago that it kept its own counsel about temperature and did not care what the sky was doing. She picked up the borrowed spade. She positioned it against the sod at the edge of her cutting ground, where the grass was thickest and the roots ran deepest. She pressed the blade down with her foot, feeling the familiar resistance of roots that did not want to be severed, earth that did not want to be disturbed, prairie that did not want to become a house. She cut anyway. The first brick separated from the ground with a sound like tearing cloth. She pried it free, lifted it, felt the weight settle into her arms and her back and her knees. 40 pounds, maybe 45. Her hands tightened on the saw, her spine compressed, her knees complained. But she held it. She carried it to the tarp, set it down, and walked back for another. Cut, pry, lift, carry, set down, walk back. The sun was going down. The grass was turning gold in the low light. Somewhere to the east, Oscar Brandt was sitting in his frame house, certain that she would fail. Somewhere in town, Elroy Tate was calculating the value of her land. Somewhere far to the east, Raymond Hargrove was spending money his mother had earned, riding a horse his family needed, living a life that did not include the people he had left behind. Edna cut another brick. Her hands trembled, not from fear, not from cold, from 62 years of living that had settled into her bones and her joints and her muscles like sediment at the bottom of a river, heavy and permanent and impossible to wash away. But the brick separated from the earth, and she lifted it, and she carried it to the tarp, and she went back for another. The prairie watched. The wind blew, the grass bent and swayed and whispered in a language that Edna did not speak but was beginning to understand. The language of things that endure, the language of roots that hold, the language of earth that does not let go. She had begun. The work had its own rhythm. Cut, haul, stack, rest, cut again. Edna woke before dawn every morning, not because she wanted to, because the darkness was a gift she could not afford to waste. The cool hours before sunrise were the only hours when her body moved without fighting her, when the stiffness in her back had not yet been heated into a sharp grinding pain by the repetition of bending and lifting and carrying, when her hands were still loose enough from sleep to grip the spade without the feeling that someone was pressing a lit match into each crack in her palms. She cut sod with Marta's borrowed spade. The blade was better than her old one, sharper with a handle that did not threaten to split with every downward thrust. She sliced vertical lines into the prairie, 12 inches apart, pressing the blade deep with her ear forward, feeling the roots resist and then surrender. Then horizontal lines every 18 inches, creating rectangles she could lift. Each brick required a dozen cuts and then a hard prying motion, a levering of the blade beneath the sod, a breaking of the last root connections that held each brick to the earth it had been part of for 1,000 years. The grass fought her, every single brick. The roots did not want to be separated from each other. They had spent decades weaving together, building a network beneath the surface that was stronger than anything visible above it. Cutting sod was not like cutting wood or cloth or any material that yielded to a blade. It was like cutting muscle, like severing something alive that gripped and held and refused to let go until the steel forced it apart. She loaded the bricks onto the canvas tarp, 3 at a time, 4 if she pushed herself, if her back was cooperating, if the bricks were on the lighter side of 40 pounds. She grabbed the edges of the tarp and pulled. The bricks slid across the grass, the canvas leaving trails in the green, like the marks of some enormous snake dragging itself across the prairie. The first day, the grass sprang back after each trip. By the end of the first week, the trails had worn down to bare dirt. Permanent paths, evidence of repetition, proof that one woman had walked this route so many times that even the prairie had given up trying to erase her passage. The foundation pit was shored. The first course of sod laid along the bottom of the excavation bricks, fitted together like puzzle pieces, roots interlocking with roots. Now she was building upward, brick by brick, course by course. The walls rising inch by inch, 4 inches per course, each course laid with the grass, side down, each brick staggered against the one below it like a mason laying stone. Her body told her the cost of every inch. The blisters came on the second day. Hot, fluid-filled swellings on both palms right at the base of her fingers where the spade handle pressed hardest. She wrapped them with strips of cloth torn from a petticoat she no longer needed because vanity had been the first thing she abandoned on this claim. The blisters broke on the 4th day. The fluid ran down her wrists and mixed with dirt and dried into a crust that cracked every time she closed her hands. By the end of the 2nd week, calluses had formed. Thick ridges of hardened skin that rose like small mountain ranges across her palms. But the calluses cracked, too, splitting along the lines where the skin was driest, opening into fissures that bled when the air turned cold and bled again when she gripped the spade and bled again when she washed her hands in water that was never warm enough. She used Marta's lard every night, rubbing it into the cracks with her fingertips, feeling the sting of fat against raw flesh, wrapping her hands in cloth while she slept. Her back was worse, not the dull ache of a long day's work. She knew that ache. She had known it for 30 years. This was different. A sharp, grinding pain that settled into the lower part of her spine like a nail driven between the vertebrae and then bent over so it could not be removed. It was there when she woke. It was there when she worked. It was there when she lay down at night, and it followed her into sleep and was waiting for her when she opened her eyes in the morning. She slept on her stomach because lying on her back made the muscles seize. In some mornings, the bad mornings, she could not stand upright at all, until she had walked in slow circles beside the wagon for 15 or 20 minutes, forcing her body to remember how to straighten, coaxing her spine into a position that allowed her to walk to the building site and pick up the spade and begin again. She was 62 years old. Every brick weighed 40 pounds. Some weighed 50 when the earth was moist. She had lost 15 pounds, maybe more, and when she caught her reflection in the window glass, she had not yet installed propped against the wagon wheel, she saw a face she barely recognized. Cheekbones that had not been visible 2 months ago. Hollows beneath her eyes that looked like shadows even in full sunlight. The face of someone being consumed by the work she was doing, burned from the inside by effort and hunger, and the particular exhaustion of a body that was too old for what was being asked of it, but too stubborn to admit defeat. Rudy tried to help. He was 6 years old, and he worked like someone who understood with perfect clarity that his labor might be the margin between living and dying. He carried brush from the creek bottom, 3/4 of a mile each way, armloads of wild plum branches and willow switches that would form the underlayer of the roof. He held stakes while Edna measured. He watched over Lenny when Edna needed both hands free, which was always because building a house required 2 hands and watching a 4-year-old also required 2 hands, and Edna had only the one pair. He did not complain. He did not ask why they could not live in a real house like the Pfeiffers. He did not ask when his father was coming back. He had stopped asking that question in the first week, and Edna did not know whether he had stopped because he already knew the answer or because he had decided the answer did not matter. Either way, the silence where that question used to be was the loudest thing about him. Lenny was too young for real work, but she refused to stay idle. She followed Edna everywhere, a small shadow moving through the grass, handing her grandmother items that were rarely the right items, but were offered with such earnest determination that Edna accepted every one. A stick when she needed a stake, a pebble when she needed a brick. There was a scratch on her forearm from the rough edge of the sod. Her face was flushed with effort. Edna pulled her granddaughter against her chest and held her. She did not speak. There were no words for what she felt in that moment. Not in English, not in German, not in any language she had ever heard spoken. She just held the child and breathed and felt the small heartbeat against her own, and the wind moving through the grass, and the weight of everything she was trying to build, and everyone she was trying to save pressing down on her shoulders like the sky itself. The walls rose. First course, second course, third course. Each course was 4 inches of height, 4 inches closer to a roof, 4 inches farther from the ground, 4 inches of accumulated labor that could be measured in sweat and blood, and the particular currency of hours that would never be returned. By the end of September, the walls were 3 feet tall. 12 courses of sod brick, stacked and leveled and chinked with loose dirt, packed into the gaps with her bare hands. Edna could stand in the pit and see over the walls now, her eyes just clearing the top course, the prairie stretching away in every direction. Beautiful, indifferent, lethal. The grass was changing color. The deep green of August had faded into the gold of September, and the gold was beginning to brown at the edges, drying, crackling underfoot, surrendering its moisture to an air that was growing sharper with each passing day. The geese flew south in long, ragged V formations that seemed to mock her with their freedom, their ability to simply rise above the coming cold and fly away from it. Edna could not fly. She could only stack bricks and count courses and watch the season turn around her like a wheel she could not stop. The weather turned in the 3rd week of September. She woke one morning to frost on the water bucket. A thin skin of ice had formed overnight, delicate as glass. And when she broke it with her finger, the cold shocked her fully awake in a way that no amount of coffee or willpower ever could. The air smelled different, sharper. There was an edge to it that had not been there the day before, a metallic tang that she recognized from winters past the smell of cold coming. Not here yet, but close, and getting closer. She looked at her walls, 3 feet tall. She needed 5 feet above ground. 2 more feet, 48 more inches, 12 more courses, 100 more bricks at least cut and hauled and stacked. 12 weeks had become 9. 9 weeks had become 6. The frost was a message. Winter did not negotiate. It did not send ambassadors or offer extensions or care about the plans of old women. It came when it came, and everything caught in its path either survived or did not. Edna worked faster. She cut bricks until her arms trembled, and her shoulders burned, and the muscles in her forearms twitched involuntarily from the repetitive motion of driving the spade into the earth. The walls rose another foot by the end of the week, but so did the stakes. Every night was colder than the last. Every morning brought new frost. Then the rain came. 3 days of continuous downpour. Not the gentle rain of spring, the kind that soaks the earth and makes things grow. This was October rain, cold and relentless, and driven sideways by a wind that had decided to remind everyone on the Nebraska prairie that comfort was temporary and shelter was not guaranteed. The prairie became a sea of mud. The cutting ground where Edna harvested her sod bricks turned into a swamp, the carefully scored lines dissolving the bricks she had pre-cut, absorbing water until they swelled and softened and weighed half again what they had weighed when the earth was dry. Bricks that had been 40 pounds were now 60, too heavy for her to lift cleanly, too heavy for her back, which had been screaming at her for weeks and was now making sounds she could feel in her teeth. The walls absorbed the rain like sponges. She watched from the wagon as the courses she had so carefully stacked seemed to sag the bricks, settling into each other, the mortar of loose dirt washing away in thin brown streams that ran down the wall faces like tears. The top courses shifted. The alignment she had worked so hard to maintain, checking each brick with her eye, nudging each one into position, with hands that knew the difference between level and almost level, that alignment was disappearing under the weight of water that the sod could not refuse to absorb. She was terrified, not for herself. She had been terrified for herself so many times since August that the feeling had lost its edge, worn smooth like a stone in a river still present, but no longer sharp enough to cut. She was terrified for the walls, because if the walls collapsed, there was no time to rebuild them. October was already here. The first freeze was weeks away, maybe less. If the walls fell, everything fell with them. The house, the plan, the chance, all of it returning to mud and grass and an empty claim that Elroy Tate would file on before the ground thawed. She and the children huddled in the wagon while rain drummed on the canvas and leaked through the tear she had never mended, because mending required time and time was something she had decided to spend on walls instead of comfort. Rudy shivered beneath the blankets. Not dramatically, not the violent shaking of someone in real danger, but the quiet, persistent trembling of a child whose body was telling him what his mind already knew. That canvas was not shelter. That a wagon was not a home, that they were one season away from something he could not name but could feel approaching. Lenny cried. She cried because she was cold and because her blanket was damp and because she was 4 years old and the world was supposed to be warm and dry and safe, and it was none of those things. Edna held them both against her body and watched her walls through the gap in the canvas, waiting for them to fall. Day one, the rain did not stop. The walls sagged another fraction of an inch. Day two, the rain intensified. Edna could hear the water running down the wall. Faces could see the brown streams carrying dissolved earth away from the structure, could feel in her bones the slow, terrible mathematics of weight and water and gravity. Day three, the rain continued. Edna stopped watching. She held her grandchildren and closed her eyes and listened to the sound of everything she had built being tested by something she could not control. The walls did not fall. On the morning of the fourth day, the rain stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden it woke her from a sleep she did not remember entering. She climbed out of the wagon into a world that smelled of wet earth and relief, and she walked to the building site with mud sucking at her boots and her heart beating in her throat. The walls had settled, perhaps an inch lower than before, perhaps a little more in the corners where the drainage was worst. The alignment was off. The courses that had been level were now slightly bowed, slightly uneven. The wall faces rougher than they had been, marked by the tracks of water and the erosion of loose fill. But they were standing. The dense root structure of the sod bricks had locked together. Root gripping root. Grass intertwined with grass. Earth holding earth. The same network that had fought her when she tried to cut each brick from the prairie had now become the thing that held those bricks together. The roots had woven themselves into the wall the way they had woven themselves into the ground, creating bonds that water could erode but not dissolve, that weight could compress but not collapse. The walls looked rougher now, less like something a human had built and more like something that had grown from the earth on its own. But they were standing. and standing was enough. 5 days lost. 3 to rain, 2 more waiting for the cutting ground to dry enough to work. 5 days she could not afford subtracted from a margin that had no room for subtraction. But the walls had held, and Edna had learned something she could not have learned any other way. Her walls were stronger than she thought. The help came on a Tuesday in the 5th week of October. Dieter Voss was 62 years old, the same age as Edna. A Volga German who had followed the path that many Volga Germans followed from Germany to Russia, and then from Russia to America, arriving in Nebraska in 1880, with a wife named Katharina who had survived the journey in the first winter, in the second winter, and the third winter, but had not survived the cholera that swept through the county in 1884. He lived 4 miles south, alone on a claim he had proved up years ago, surrounded by the accumulated silence of a man who had outlived the only person whose voice he wanted to hear. His house was adequate. His land produced enough. His life continued in the mechanical way that lives continue when the reason for living has been removed, but the habit of living remains. He arrived with a half-broken plow blade strapped to his saddle and a horse that was older than most of the children in the county. He dismounted with the careful slowness of a man whose joints had their own opinions about movement, and he stood beside his horse and looked at the walls that Edna had raised and said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke. "I have watched you work," he said. His English was worse than Edna's, thick with Russian vowels layered over German consonants, like sediment deposited by 2 different rivers. "You cut sod by hand like an animal." Edna waited. She had learned to wait. Waiting cost nothing, and words spoken too quickly often had to be taken back, and words taken back left marks that could not be smoothed over. "I have a plow, a horse." Dieter paused, searching for words in a language that was neither his first nor his second. "One day I lend them." Another pause, longer this time. The wind moved between them. "You do washing, mending, what my wife did." It was charity. The trade was so wildly unequal that calling it a trade was almost an insult to the concept. One day with a horse and a plow was worth weeks of washing and mending. Months, probably. Dieter Voss was offering her something she could not repay, and he was wrapping it in the thinnest possible layer of barter so that both of them could pretend the exchange was fair. Edna's hands were cracked and bleeding. Her back had not stopped hurting in 3 weeks. Her walls were 4 feet tall and needed to be 5, and she was running out of time in a way that she could feel in the changing temperature of the morning air, in the shortening of the daylight, in the look in Rudy's eyes when she came back to the wagon each evening, moving slower than she had moved that morning. She had 4 weeks until the first hard freeze, maybe less. She had $1.37. She had approximately enough food if she continued eating less than the children needed, which was less than she needed, which was less than her body required to do the work she was asking it to do. Pride told her to refuse. Pride told her she had come this far alone, and she should finish alone. Pride told her that accepting help was admitting weakness, and admitting weakness on the prairie was the same as admitting defeat. And admitting defeat meant Oscar Brandt was right, and Elroy Tate was right, and every person who had looked at her and seen a doomed old woman was right. Pride could burn in a ditch. Her grandchildren could not. "Yes," she said, "I accept." Dieter arrived the next morning with his horse and his plow. The horse was old and slow and had opinions about the direction it wanted to walk that did not always align with the direction Dieter wanted it to walk. The plow blade was cracked along one edge and would not last more than a day of heavy cutting. None of that mattered. In 8 hours of work, Edna cut more sod than she had cut by hand in 3 weeks. The plow sliced through the prairie in long, continuous strips, the blade severing roots that had taken her a dozen strokes with a spade. The horse pulled the plow forward at a pace that was slow by farming standards, but miraculous by the standards of a 62-year-old woman who had been crawling across the ground on her hands and knees with a borrowed spade. She cut extra, enough for the walls, enough for the roof, enough to bank around the exterior of the house for insulation, a thick buffer of sod piled against the outer wall faces to add another layer of earth between the interior and the wind. Enough to give her a margin that she had never had before, a cushion of material that meant she could lose a few bricks to breakage or poor cutting and still have enough to finish. That evening, Dieter rode home with a bundle of mended shirts and a stack of washed linens that Edna had prepared the night before, working by lantern light, until her eyes blurred because she wanted the trade to look like a trade, even if both of them knew it was something else. He did not say goodbye. He did not offer to return. He had given what he could give, and he expected nothing more. And the silence of his departure was the silence of a man who understood that some debts are not meant to be repaid in kind. They are meant to be repaid by surviving. Edna stood beside her walls, 5 feet tall now, finally reaching the height she needed. The sun was going down and the walls cast long shadows across the excavated ground, shadows that looked like the walls of a house, which is what they were becoming. Not yet a house, not yet a home, but something. Something with dimensions and angles and the solidity of earth shaped by human hands into a form the earth had never taken on its own. She had accepted help. She had let someone see her weakness. She had opened a door she had kept locked since August, the door behind which she kept the knowledge that she could not do everything alone, that strength had limits, that stubbornness was not the same as capability. And she was still standing. And the walls were still standing. And the house was still possible. The ridgepole nearly killed her. She had gathered the willow poles from the creek bottom over the course of several days, carrying them back to the claim, 2 or 3 at a time, balanced across her shoulders the way she had seen men carry fence rails. Each pole was 6 to 8 feet long and perhaps 3 inches in diameter, thin and flexible, the kind of wood that would bend under pressure rather than break. One pole was useless as a ridge beam. It would bow and snap the first time any weight was placed on it. But 3 poles lashed together with rope, twisted around each other and bound at 6-inch intervals, formed a bundled beam that was stronger than any single pole. Stronger and lighter, light enough for one person to lift, light enough in theory. The question was how to get it to the top of the walls. Edna built a crude A-frame from 2 longer poles, leaning them against the completed end walls at an angle, creating a triangular structure that looked like the skeleton of a tent. She ran a rope over the peak of the A-frame, threading it through a groove she had carved in the wood with her knife. A simple pulley system. Not elegant, not engineered, just rope and gravity and the desperate mathematics of a woman who needed to raise a 100-pound beam to a height of 5 feet without any help. She tied one end of the rope to the bundled ridge beam. She held the other end in her bleeding hands. She pulled. The beam rose 6 inches off the ground. A foot, 2 feet. The rope cut into the cracks in her palms. The A-frame creaked under the shifting weight. The beam swayed pendulum-like, bumping against the wall face, and Edna adjusted her grip and her stance and her breathing and pulled again. 3 feet. The beam was level with her waist now. The A-frame groaned. Then the lashing slipped. One of the 3 willow poles twisted inside the binding, sliding sideways, pulling free of the rope that held the bundle to the hauling line. The entire structure began to rotate, the loose pole threatening to separate from the other 2, the beam transforming from a solid unit into 3 individual sticks that would fall in 3 different directions and possibly take the A-frame and possibly the wall itself down with them. Edna threw herself against the A-frame. She braced it with her shoulder, with her hip, with the full weight of her body pressed against the wood, while she reached up with one hand and tried to retie the lashing. The rope cut deeper into her palm. She could feel the fibers biting into raw flesh. The poles swayed. The A-frame tilted. For one terrible suspended moment, she thought everything was going to collapse. The ridge beam, the A-frame, the rope, all of it crashing down onto walls that might not survive the impact, walls that had taken her 10 weeks to build, and that could be destroyed in 2 seconds by the physics of falling wood. She caught it. She caught the loose pole with her free hand and shoved it back into alignment and retied the lashing with fingers that were slippery with blood and shaking so badly that the knot she tied was ugly, asymmetrical. Nothing like the careful bindings she had made on the ground. But it held. The bundle held. The poles stayed together. She resumed pulling. The beam rose higher. 3 feet, 4 feet, level with the top of the walls. Her arms were burning. Her back had passed through pain into a territory beyond pain, a white-hot numbness that she knew meant she was doing damage she would pay for tomorrow, and the day after, and every day for the rest of her life. Then the A-frame cracked. One of the support poles had a weak spot, a notch in the grain, a flaw she had not seen when she selected it in the dim light at the creek bottom, a place where the wood was thin and dry and ready to fail. It split with a sound like a gunshot, a sharp, violent crack that echoed across the empty prairie and sent a spike of pure terror through Edna's chest. She dropped to the ground as the A-frame tilted sideways. The support pole buckled, and the entire structure leaned, dumping the ridge beam onto the wall top. It landed crooked, half on the wall, half hanging over the edge, teetering. Edna scrambled up the earthen ramp she had built for placing high coarse bricks. Her knees screamed, her back locked. She ignored all of it. She reached the top of the wall and shoved the beam with her shoulder. It moved an inch. She repositioned herself and shoved again with her hip, this time driving her body against the bundled wood the way a person drives a shoulder against a door that refuses to open. The beam slid another inch. Another. She got her hands under it. She lifted with her legs, feeling tendons stretch and muscles tear, and something in her lower back give way with a sensation like a guitar string snapping. She did not stop. She could not stop. If the beam fell now, she did not have the strength to raise it again. Not today, maybe not ever. The ridge beam settled into the notches she had cut in the top course of the end walls. Rough, uneven, sitting at a slight angle that would need to be corrected later, but in place. Edna sat on the wall top as the sun went down. Her hands were bleeding freely. Her back was in spasm. Her vision had narrowed to a tunnel that pulsed with each heartbeat. Below her on the ground outside the house, Rudy was crying. He had watched the A-frame crack. He had heard the sound of splitting wood, a sound that could have been his grandmother's bones, and he had seen her body jerk and drop, and he had thought for one frozen instant that she was falling, that she was dead, that he was alone. "It's all right," Edna called down to him. Her voice cracked on the second word. "It's all right, we are almost done." She was lying. She was not almost done. She still needed rafters, willow poles laid from the ridge beam to the wall tops at regular intervals. She still needed brush armloads of plum branches and willow switches to create a lattice beneath the sod. She still needed grass and sod to lay on top of that lattice, a living roof that would shed some of the rain and hold some of the warmth and add its weight to the walls that held it up. She still needed a door. She still needed to install the window glass. She still needed to connect the stovepipe and seal the gaps and pack the cracks and complete the 100 small tasks that stood between a structure and a shelter. But the ridge beam was up. The impossible part was finished. Oscar Brandt had said it took 3 strong men. She had done it alone. At 62, with bleeding hands and a broken A-frame and a back that might never fully straighten again. That night, after Rudy and Lenny were asleep in the wagon, after she had fed them the last of the salt pork and a portion of dried corn that was smaller than it should have been because the food was running out, Edna sat alone outside the wagon and looked at the sky. The stars were there. They were always there. They did not care about ridge poles or bleeding hands or old women who had done things that everyone said could not be done. She cried, not loudly, not dramatically. The roof might leak, and the walls might crack, and the food might run out, and the cold might come earlier and harder than anyone expected. But the ridge beam was up. And if the ridge beam was up, then the roof was possible. And if the roof was possible, then the house was possible. And if the house was possible, then survival was possible. And possibility was all she had ever asked for. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She wrapped her bleeding palms in fresh cloth. She rubbed lard into the cracks. Tomorrow there was more work to do. The house was finished on October the 10th, 1887. Edna stood outside in the late afternoon light and looked at what she had built. 10 feet by 12 feet, walls 2 feet thick and 5 feet tall above the sunken floor. A sod roof laid over a lattice of willow poles and plum brush. A roof that would leak, she had no illusions about that, but that would hold through anything short of a tornado. One window facing south, the glass she had carried 8 miles from town, installed in a frame of salvaged wagon boards. A door of the same boards hung on leather hinges she had cut from an old belt latched from inside with a wooden bar. It was the smallest house in Custer County. It had cost $2.60 in cash, $1.12 for the window glass, the rest for nails and a few feet of tar paper that Marta Pfeiffer had found somewhere and traded for mending that would take Edna all winter to complete. Everything else had come free from the earth. Sod bricks cut by hand, willow poles gathered from the creek, roots holding the walls together like the grip of something alive, dirt packed into every gap, grass growing on the roof already beginning to take hold, sending new roots into the sod, binding itself to the structure as if the prairie had decided to accept this small rearrangement of its surface. She stepped inside. The cook stove sat against the north wall, its pipe rising through a hole in the roof sealed with mud and tar paper. The stove glowed with a small fire she had lit to test the draft, and the heat filled the space the way water fills a cup, completely touching every surface, warming every corner. The dirt floor was packed as hard as stone, smoothed by hours of tamping with a flat board until it was level and firm, and as close to a proper floor as dirt could be. The walls rose around her, solid and silent, 2 feet of earth between the inside and the outside. She pressed her palm flat against the interior surface and felt warmth. Not from the stove, from the sun. The south-facing wall had absorbed the afternoon heat through its full thickness, and now it was radiating that warmth inward, slowly, steadily, the way a stone holds warmth after a day in the sun. She did not understand the science. She did not have words for what was happening. She only knew that the wall was warm under her hand, and the air was warm around her body, and the house felt solid in a way that the wagon never had. Rudy and Lenny explored every corner. There were not many corners to explore. The entire interior was perhaps the size of 2 wagon beds laid side by side. But they explored them anyway, running their hands along the earthen walls, peering into the spaces behind the stove, testing the firmness of the floor with their feet. Rudy claimed a spot near the stove. He sat down on the bedding that Edna had arranged along the east wall and leaned his back against the swanny that enclosed his eyes and smiled. It was the first time Edna had seen him smile in 2 months. Lenny wanted to sleep by the window. She pressed her face against the glass that had cost $1.12, and looked out at the prairie and said she wanted to watch the stars from her bed. Edna stood in the doorway, the door open behind her. The prairie stretched out gold and brown and endless under the October sky. She watched her grandchildren settle into the house she had built with her own hands. Her back ached. Her hands were scarred, mapped with new calluses, over cracks that might never fully heal. She had lost 15 pounds she could not afford to lose. Her knees would never bend the way they had in August. But they had a roof, they had walls, they had a stove that worked, and a floor that was dry, and a window that faced south and caught the light. They had a chance. That night, for the first time since Raymond left, Edna Hargrove slept without dreaming of failure. She slept in a house that smelled of earth and grass in the faint warmth of a stove banked low for the night. She slept with her grandchildren beside her, their breathing steady, their bodies warm, their faces peaceful, in the way that children's faces are only peaceful when they feel safe. The walls surrounded them, 2 feet thick, 5 feet tall, built from the ground they stood on by the hands of a woman who everyone said could not do it. The walls held. Outside, the wind blew across the Nebraska prairie the way it had blown for 1,000 years. It pushed against the sea and found no way in. It pressed against the roof and found no gap. It circled the small house like something curious, something testing, and then it moved on, carrying the sound of grass and distance and the approaching winter across a landscape that stretched to every horizon. The wind would come back. It always came back. And when it returned, it would bring the cold with it, and the cold would bring the snow, and the snow would bring the storm. But that was tomorrow, and tomorrow's storm was tomorrow's problem. Tonight the walls held. Tonight was enough. The weeks that followed were a different kind of work. Not easier, different. The house was built, but the winter was not survived. The walls were standing, but the fuel was not gathered. The roof was finished, but the cold had not yet tested it. Not truly, not in the way that Nebraska cold tested everything, pressing against every surface, searching for every crack, finding every weakness that summer construction had hidden and autumn optimism had ignored. Edna gathered fuel the way a squirrel gathers acorns, with urgency, with the particular desperation of a creature that can feel the season turning in its bones and knows that every hour spent resting is an hour stolen from survival. Twisted grass. She pulled it from the prairie in thick handfuls, braided it into dense ropes, the thickness of her wrist, and stacked the ropes against the exterior wall of the house. Buffalo chips. She walked the prairie in widening circles, collecting the dried dung that dotted the landscape like dark coins scattered by a careless hand. Anything that would burn. Dried stalks, dead brush from the creek bottom, the broken remnants of her A-frame splintered wood that had nearly killed her, but would now keep her grandchildren warm. The fuel pile grew. It climbed the exterior wall like a living thing, reaching higher each day until it stood taller than Rudy, then taller than the door. Edna looked at it and calculated. 4 weeks of heavy burning. Maybe 3 if the temperatures dropped as far as the old-timers said they could drop. Maybe 5 if she rationed carefully, if she burned low during the day and high only at night, if she trusted the walls to hold warmth, the way they had held warmth on the mild October evenings when the stove was barely lit and the interior stayed comfortable until dawn. Maybe, the word that frontier women lived and died by. Marta Pfeiffer brought more tar paper traded for mending that would keep Edna's needle busy through the darkest months. Old Dieter Voss came by once with a quarter of venison wrapped in burlap and tied with twine. He refused payment. He said it was from a deer that would have spoiled anyway, and Edna accepted the lie along with the meat because they both understood that the fiction of exchange was a kindness they offered each other. There was no such thing as spoiling meat in October. The air was already cold enough to preserve anything that did not walk away on its own legs. The house performed exactly as Edna had hoped, and better than she had dared expect. On the first truly cold night, 14 degrees Fahrenheit. According to a mercury thermometer that a neighbor had given her, mounted on a small wooden board that she hung from a nail near the door, Edna built a moderate fire and watched the interior temperature climb. The stove radiated heat into the small space and the earthen walls absorbed it, drank it in the way dry ground drinks, rain pulling the warmth into their 2-foot thickness and holding it there. By evening, the interior had settled at 52 degrees, warm enough to sleep without shivering, warm enough to work without gloves, warm enough that Lenny stopped wearing her coat inside and Rudy stopped sleeping with his boots on. But it was what happened after the fire died that surprised Edna. She let the stove burn down to coals around midnight, conserving fuel the way she conserved everything, and she expected the temperature to fall. It did fall, but slowly. So slowly that she checked the thermometer twice, thinking the mercury had stuck. The walls that had absorbed the stove's heat during the evening were now releasing it, radiating warmth back into the room, the way a stone releases warmth after a day in the sun. Steadily, gradually. The interior temperature dropped from 52 to 48, then to 45. By morning, when the outside air was still 14 degrees, the inside of the house was 36, 22 degrees warmer than the air outside, with no fire burning, with nothing but 2 feet of earth between her family and the cold. Edna pressed her hand against the interior wall. It was warm, not hot, never hot, but warm to the touch in a way that wood walls never were, in a way that she had not expected and could not explain. The walls were giving back what they had taken in. They were holding heat the way a body holds heat, not perfectly, not forever, but long enough. Long enough for the fuel to last. Long enough for the fire to rest. Long enough for an old woman and 2 children to sleep through the night without waking to a house that had turned into an icebox. She did not understand the science. She did not know the words thermal mass or heat capacity or radiant exchange. It piled against the sod walls in drifts that climbed higher each week, burying the lower half of the house, covering the fuel pile, blocking the door until Edna had to shovel her way out each morning. The world turned white and silent. Sounds were muffled by the snow. The prairie she had walked all autumn, the grass and the low hills and the distant fence posts marking neighboring claims, all of it was gone, erased, replaced by a blank white sheet that stretched to every horizon, featureless and absolute. Oscar Brandt came by in the second week of December. He had not visited since August, since his warning about freezing grandchildren in half-built hovels. He rode up to the buried house and dismounted and stared at the smoke rising from the chimney pipe. The pipe poked above the snow like the periscope of some subterranean vessel, and the smoke rose from it in a thin gray line that bent eastward in the wind and dissolved into a sky the color of old iron. "You are still here," he said when Edna opened the door. "We are still here." He looked at the walls, at the roof, at the drifted snow that had buried the house nearly to the roofline. He did not ask to come inside, and Edna did not invite him. Something had settled between them that summer day in August, a distance measured not in miles but in the weight of words that had been spoken too confidently and received too silently, and that distance had not diminished with time. It had hardened. "This cold is nothing," Oscar said. "Wait until January. Wait until a real blizzard comes. Those thin walls will not hold." "The walls are 2 feet thick." Sod is not wood. Sod is not stone. Sod is dirt with grass in it. He shook his head. The gesture carried the authority of 9 winters and 20 sod houses, built with proper crews and proper tools, and the certainty that comes from experience. He was not guessing, he was remembering. And what he remembered told him that this small house built by one old woman with a borrowed spade could not possibly survive what January would bring. One mild winter does not prove anything, he said. You got lucky with the fall. Do not mistake luck for skill. He rode away without saying goodbye. Edna watched him disappear into the white landscape and thought about what he had said. He was not entirely wrong. The winter had been cold so far, brutally cold by any normal standard, but it had not produced a blizzard. No killing wind, no whiteout, nothing that truly tested the limits of what she had built. The walls had held against 14 degrees. They had held against 0. They had held against 10 below and 20 below, and the slow grinding cold of December nights that seemed to last forever. They had not been tested against 40 below. They had not been tested against wind. Edna looked at her fuel pile. She had enough for perhaps 4 weeks of heavy burning. She spent the rest of December gathering what she could find. Twisted grass from spots the snow had not yet buried. Dried stalks along fence lines. Anything combustible. By the end of the month, she had perhaps 4 weeks' worth. It would have to be enough. January began with cold so deep it felt personal, as if the sky itself had looked down at this small house on the Nebraska prairie and decided to see what it was made of. 20 below 0, 25 below, 30 below. The mercury retreated to the bottom of the thermometer and seemed reluctant to climb. Edna burned through fuel faster than she wanted, feeding the stove, through the long nights watching the interior temperature fluctuate between 45 and 50 degrees, while the outside dropped to numbers that belonged in stories told to frightened children, not on the wooden board nailed beside her door. Then on January the 11th, the weather broke. Edna woke to sunlight streaming through her south-facing window. The light fell across the dirt floor in a warm rectangle that Lenny immediately claimed sitting cross-legged in the bright patch like a cat turning her face toward the glass with her eyes closed. The air felt different, softer, warmer, as if spring had arrived 3 months early and forgotten to announce itself. Edna opened the door and stepped outside and felt the temperature on her skin. Above freezing, perhaps 30 degrees, maybe higher. After weeks of cold that made her teeth ache just from breathing, this warmth felt like a hallucination. Rudy asked if he could go outside without his coat. She said yes. Across the prairie, other families were making the same decision. Children walked to school in light clothing. Farmers drove to town without gloves. Teachers propped open schoolhouse doors to let in the mild air. After weeks of brutal, bone-deep, spirit-crushing, cold, the warm spell felt like a gift, like forgiveness. Edna spent the day gathering more fuel. Twisted grass, buffalo chips, dried stalks, anything she could find on the thawed prairie. She did not know why she felt such urgency. The weather was warm, her fuel supply was adequate. There was no logical reason to work as if her life depended on it, but something in the air felt wrong. The warmth was too sudden, too complete. The old-timers had a saying about weather that changed too fast. Nothing good comes quick. Temperature swings like this from 30 below to 30 above in the span of a week, these were not gifts. These were warnings. The prairie pulling back its fist before it swung. 62 years of living had taught Edna many things she could not explain. How bread dough felt when it was ready. How a sick child's forehead felt different from a tired child's forehead. How the air tasted before a thunderstorm, metallic and heavy, like licking a penny. And how weather that changed too fast carried something behind it that had not yet arrived. By evening, she had added 2 days' worth of fuel to her supply. She went to bed with the fire banked low, trusting the walls to hold whatever warmth they had absorbed during the mild day. Rudy and Lenny slept soundly on the bed. They shared their bodies curled together under blankets that smelled of wood smoke and dried grass and the particular warmth of children who feel safe enough to sleep deeply. Edna did not sleep deeply. She slept the way animals sleep when they sense a predator nearby, in fragments, waking to listen for something she could not name, checking the fire, checking the door, checking the window for changes in the sky that she could not see in the dark, but felt she should be watching for anyway. 400 miles to the northwest, a wall of Arctic air was racing south at 40 miles per hour. It had formed over the Canadian prairie, a massive dome of cold that had been building for days, gathering strength and density and the particular violence that comes from air masses that have nothing between them and the pole except flat frozen ground. By morning, it would reach Montana. By midday, it would cross into Dakota Territory. By afternoon, it would slam into Nebraska with a force that would be remembered for generations. Edna knew none of this. She only knew that the warm spell felt wrong, and the silence felt heavy with waiting, and her body refused to rest when rest was what she needed most. The morning of January 12, 1888 began with sunshine. Edna woke to light through the window, the same mild warmth as the day before. The interior of the house was 42 degrees cool but comfortable. The walls were still radiating heat absorbed during yesterday's thaw. She built a small fire to take the edge off and began preparing breakfast. Rudy was restless. He had been confined for most of December and early January, and 2 days of warm weather had reminded him what freedom felt like. He asked to go outside. "Stay close," Edna told him. "Do not go past the fuel pile." He promised. He ran out the door into the mild morning, his breath barely visible in the warm air. He was 6 years old and he had not run in weeks, and the prairie was open and the sun was shining, and for a few minutes he was just a boy and not a survivor. Lenny wanted to follow, but Edna kept her inside. Something about the sky made her uneasy, a darkness on the northwestern horizon that had not been there at dawn. Not clouds exactly, something denser, a gray-white wall stretching across the horizon from north to south, tall as a mountain range moving toward them with a speed that she could track with her eyes. By mid-morning, the wall had grown. It filled the northwestern sky like a curtain being drawn across a stage. The wind had shifted. The air went from clear to white in the space of a single breath, as if someone had thrown a sheet over the entire prairie and pulled it tight. The wind struck like a fist. It hit the house. It hit Edna. It nearly knocked her off her feet. The temperature dropped so fast that she gasped, the cold searing her lungs, each breath a knife drawn through her chest. "Rudy," she ran, into the white, into the wind, into a wall of driven snow so dense that she could not see her hand in front of her face. The snow was not falling, it was flying, horizontal, driven by wind that screamed at a pitch she had never heard, a sound that was not like any weather she had experienced, a sound that was more like a living thing, something enormous and enraged, something that had come to tear the world apart. She could not see the house behind her. She could not see the ground beneath her feet. She could not see anything except white. White in her eyes, her mouth, her nose. White filling every space between her body and the rest of the world. The wind hit her from the right side and she staggered and corrected and staggered again. She stopped. She could not find him by running blind. The prairie was enormous and her grandson was small, and the snow had erased every landmark in every direction and every point of reference she had ever used to navigate this land. Running blind was dying blind. She would pass within 3 feet of him and never know it. She forced herself to think. The wind was from the northwest. Rudy had been southeast of the house when the storm hit. If she turned her back to the wind and walked at an angle compensating for the tendency to drift, she should move roughly toward where he had been standing. She turned. She walked. She counted steps because counting was the only measurement she had left in a world that had lost all others. 30 steps, 40, 50. Her face was burning where the snow struck it. Her eyes were frozen half shut. Her hands stretched out in front of her, like a blind woman feeling for walls were already numb. 60 steps. She collided with him. He was standing in place, frozen. Not frozen by the cold, not yet, but frozen by terror. The absolute paralysis of a 6-year-old child who had been walking across a sunlit prairie one second and was lost in a howling white void the next. He was crying, but she could not hear him over the wind. She could only feel his body shaking against hers when she grabbed him and pulled him against her chest. She turned back toward the house, into the wind now, the snow driving directly into her face like 1,000 needles of ice fired from 1,000 tiny guns. She could not see. She could not breathe without turning her head sideways and gasping for air that was more snow than oxygen. She held Rudy against her with one arm and extended the other in front of her and walked. She counted steps. She prayed. Not formal prayers, not the prayers she had learned in church in Saxony, but the formless, desperate prayers of a woman who had one arm around a child and the other reaching into nothing, and no way of knowing whether the next step would bring her to safety or carry her past it into the open prairie, where they would both be found in the spring, if they were found at all. Her shoulder hit something solid, the sod wall. She had found it. She had calculated the angle correctly, or God had guided her steps, or luck had intervened, or some combination of all three that she would never be able to separate into its component parts. Her shoulder was pressed against 2 feet of solid earth, the wall she had built with her own hands, and she had never felt anything so beautiful in her life. She felt along the wall, her fingers tracing the rough surface of the sod, the bumps and ridges of individual bricks, the chinked gaps where she had packed loose dirt. She moved left, then right, then left again. The door. Her hand found the wooden bar. She pulled it open against the wind, the door swinging inward with a violence that nearly tore it from its leather hinges. She shoved Rudy inside. She threw herself in after him. She slammed the door shut and dropped the bar into place and leaned against it with her full weight, while the wind screamed outside like something that had been cheated of its prey. The silence inside was a physical thing. It had weight. It had texture. It pressed against her ears like water. Lenny was crying. Rudy was shaking. Edna leaned against the door, her chest heaving, her face burning where the snow had struck, and she looked at the walls around her. 2 feet of solid earth, between her family and the storm that was trying to kill them. Now they just had to survive until it passed. The first hour, Edna thought only about warmth. Rudy was shaking so hard his teeth chattered. His hands were white, at the fingertips the color drained by cold, the beginning of frostbite forming in the small vessels beneath the skin. Edna stripped off his wet clothes and wrapped him in every blanket they owned, and held him against her body, and rubbed his hands between her own pressing warmth into fingers that felt like ice until the color slowly began to return. Pink creeping back into white, blood moving where blood had stopped. Then she noticed Lenny, the flush on her cheeks, the brightness in her eyes that had nothing to do with the fire and nothing to do with fear. Edna pressed her palm to her granddaughter's forehead. Hot, too hot, the kind of hot that meant something inside the child's body was fighting a battle that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Lenny had been fighting something for days, a cough that would not quit, a tiredness that Edna had attributed to the long winter, in the close air, in the boredom of a 4-year-old confined to a space the size of 2 wagon beds. Now in the worst possible moment, the fever had declared itself. Edna looked at Lenny. She looked at Rudy still shivering in her arms. She looked at the door rattling against its wooden bar as the wind tried to tear it from its hinges. She could not go for help. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away, and 2 miles in this storm meant death. Marta Pfeiffer might as well have been on the moon. She was alone, with a grandson who had nearly frozen and a granddaughter who was burning with fever, in a house she had built with her own hands, in the middle of the worst storm she had ever seen. She built up the fire. The storm screamed through the afternoon and into the evening. The sound was unlike anything Edna had experienced in 62 years of living. A constant roar that made conversation impossible, punctuated by gusts that shook the entire house. Gusts that felt like a giant's palm slamming against the walls. Snow drove against the sod with a hissing, scraping sound like sand blown against stone. The door rattled. The window, her $1.12 window, vibrated in its frame. But the walls held. Edna touched them as the hours passed. She pressed her palms against the interior surface, feeling for cold spots, for drafts, for any sign that the storm was breaking through. The exterior must have been frozen solid, caked with driven snow, scoured by wind that could kill in minutes. But the interior surface was cool. Not cold, perhaps 40 degrees, perhaps a little less, a temperature that a human hand could touch without recoiling. 2 feet of earth, that was all. 2 feet between 40 degrees and 40 below. The fire burned steadily. Edna fed it twisted grass and buffalo chips, watching her fuel supply diminish one handful at a time, calculating how long she could keep the flames going. The interior temperature held at 48 degrees, then 45 as the night deepened and the cold outside intensified. Then 42. She checked the thermometer. The mercury inside the house was readable. The mercury outside was not. It had retreated below the lowest mark on the scale, past 40 below, into a region of cold that the instrument had not been designed to measure. 50 below with the wind maybe colder. Numbers that did not belong to the world that Edna had grown up in, numbers from some other planet where human life was not supposed to exist. Inside, 42 degrees, cold enough to see her breath, cold enough to keep her hands in her pockets when she was not tending the fire, but not cold enough to kill. Lenny's fever spiked around midnight. The child was delirious. She thrashed in the bedding, throwing off blankets that Edna replaced and that Lenny threw off again. Her small body trapped in a cycle of sweating and shivering that neither Edna's hands nor Edna's prayers could break. She called for her father, the man who had abandoned them. The name Edna had not spoken in months. It came from Lenny's lips in a voice that was too high and too thin and too confused to be a 4-year-old's voice, a voice that belonged to the fever, not to the child. Rudy sat beside his sister. He held her hand. He was 6 years old, but in this moment, in this house, in the howling dark of the worst night any of them would ever know, he was older than 6. He was as old as the weight of watching his grandmother struggle and his sister suffer and the storm try to tear their world apart. "Is she going to die?" he asked. Edna did not answer. She did not know the answer. She wet a cloth with water from the bucket beside the stove water that had not frozen because even the water bucket stayed above 32 degrees in this house, and pressed it to Lenny's forehead. She held her granddaughter's hand and whispered words she was not sure Lenny could hear. German words. Words her own mother had whispered to her during childhood fevers in Saxony, in a stone house, an ocean away, in a life that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Words that had no power to cure anything but that carried the weight of love, spoken aloud in darkness, which was sometimes enough and sometimes was not. The fire burned lower. Edna faced a choice. She could keep the fire high and burn through her remaining fuel in 8 hours, which would keep the house at 45 degrees until the fuel ran out, and then the temperature would plummet and they would freeze. Or she could let the fire die to coals and trust the walls to hold whatever heat remained. Trust 2 feet of earth to do what 2 feet of earth had been doing for millions of years before any human being stacked it into walls and called it a house. If she kept the fire high and the fuel ran out before the storm ended, they would freeze. If she let the fire die and the walls failed to hold heat, they would freeze. She looked at Lenny, flushed and sweating. She looked at Rudy, pale and watching. She looked at the walls, 2 feet of Nebraska sod, roots woven through earth, grass laced through soil, the same material that had held together when the rain came, the same material that had dried in the sun and warmed in the autumn and absorbed heat from the stove, night after night, releasing it back slowly, steadily, like a promise kept in silence. She let the fire die to coals. The next 3 hours were the longest of Edna Hargrove's life. The interior temperature dropped, 42 degrees, 40, 38. She watched the mercury creep downward and felt the cold settling into her bones the way water settles into the lowest part of a field, finding in every hollow filling, every space. She piled every blanket, every coat, every piece of fabric they owned onto the bed where her grandchildren lay. She climbed in beside them and pulled them close, one on each side, their small bodies pressed against hers, sharing heat the way animals share heat in a den, the way her ancestors had shared heat in the stone houses of Saxony, the way human beings have always shared heat when the fire goes out and the cold comes in, and the only warmth left is the warmth of other bodies. 36 degrees. The mercury stopped falling. Edna stared at it in the dim light of the dying coals. Outside, the temperature was 40 or 50 below zero. The wind was howling at 60 miles per hour. Snow was piling against the walls in drifts that would bury the house by morning. And inside, the temperature had stabilized at 36 degrees. She reached out from under the blankets and touched the wall beside the bed. Cool, but not cold, not frozen, not the biting, searing cold of metal or wood exposed to winter air. This was the temperature of Earth, the temperature of ground that was 2 feet thick and connected to the planet itself, a planet that held heat in its core and released it through its surface and did not care about blizzards or wind or the desperate arithmetic of an old woman trying to keep 2 children alive. The walls were not just blocking the wind, they were giving back what they had taken in. Heat absorbed during warmer days stored in the dense matrix of root and soil released now in the hour of greatest need, like a hand that had been held over a fire and then pressed against a cold cheek. The warmth was borrowed. It was finite. It would not last forever. But it lasted long enough. Edna lay in the dark holding her grandchildren and listened to the storm rage outside and felt the wall warm against her back and understood something she could not put into words. Something about the earth. Something about what it meant to build a house from the ground itself, to live inside the land instead of on top of it, to trust the prairie that everyone said was trying to kill her. Lenny's breathing was ragged but steady. The fever had not broken, but it had not climbed higher. Whatever was happening inside the child's body had reached a plateau, a standoff between the illness and the small, fierce engine of a 4-year-old's immune system. Rudy had fallen asleep, his body surrendering to exhaustion, his face pressed against Edna's arm. 36 degrees, cold enough to be uncomfortable, not cold enough to die. Across the prairie, others were not so fortunate. In a frame house 12 miles north, Marta and Willem Pfeiffer huddled around a stove that could not keep pace with the cold. Marta had stuffed rags into the gaps around the windows, but snow still blew in through nail holes, forming small drifts on the floor. Frost formed on the interior walls, white crystals spreading across the boards like something alive stealing heat from the air faster than the fire could replace it. Willem burned through 3 days' worth of firewood in a single night. When the wood ran out, he burned a chair, then a table, then the bed frame from the spare room. By dawn, they had burned everything that would burn, and the interior temperature was 28 degrees. Their children survived. But Marta would later say that she sat in her house watching frost grow on the walls and believed with absolute certainty that they were all going to die. 20 miles to the northwest, a farmer named Peter Grunewald left his frame house to check on his livestock. The barn was 50 feet away, a distance he could normally walk in 30 seconds. He stepped outside and the wind knocked him to the ground. He crawled toward the barn, but lost his direction in the whiteout. They found him 2 days later, frozen solid, 8 feet from his own front door. In a one-room schoolhouse in the next county, a 19-year-old teacher named Lois Royce faced an impossible choice. Her fuel had run out by 3 in the afternoon. The temperature inside the school was dropping fast. 30 degrees, 25, 20. She had 3 students in her care, children whose parents had not come to collect them before the storm hit. Lois could see a boarding house 82 yards away. 82 yards, the length of a wheat field. She tied the children together with rope and led them into the storm. They never reached the boarding house. Lois Royce survived. She lost both feet to frostbite. The 3 children in her care froze to death within sight of shelter. Edna knew none of this. She only knew that dawn came and they were still alive. The storm had not ended, but the worst of its fury had passed. The temperature outside was still 20 below, but the killing wind had diminished. Light crept through the snow-covered window, gray and feeble but unmistakably day. Lenny's fever had broken during the night. Edna touched her granddaughter's forehead and felt coolness where there had been fire. The child was weak, her skin pale and damp, but the crisis had passed. Whatever illness had gripped her body, she had fought it off while the blizzard raged outside, as if the storm and the fever had been 2 enemies, attacking from different directions, and the child had defeated them both simply by refusing to stop breathing. Rudy was already awake, watching his grandmother with solemn eyes. "Is it over?" he asked. "Almost," Edna said. "Almost." She fed the coals with the last of her prepared fuel. The fire caught and grew. The interior temperature climbed. 38, 40, 42. By mid-morning, the wind died entirely. The silence was so complete it felt like pressure against her ears. Edna pushed the door open against a wall of white. Snow drifted 4 feet high against the entrance, burying the lower half of the doorway. She climbed over the drift and stood blinking in the sunlight. The world had been erased. Every feature she knew was gone. The grass, the low hills, the fence posts marking neighboring claims, all buried beneath white that stretched to every horizon. The sky was clear and hard and impossibly blue, the sun glaring off the snow with a brightness that made her eyes stream. She looked at her house. The sod walls rose from the drifts like something that had grown from the earth, which in a sense they had. Snow was piled against every surface, bearing the structure nearly to the roofline. But the chimney still poked above the white, and smoke still rose from it. The children's blizzard, the worst winter storm in the history of the Great Plains. The stories had a common thread. Frame houses failed. Fuel ran out. Walls that looked solid let the cold bleed through, stealing warmth faster than any stove could replace it. And then there were the other stories. The families in deep houses who survived with fuel to spare. The old-timers who had always said that sod was warmer than wood and who had been proven right in the most terrible way imaginable. Mrs. Myrtle Chapin Herrick, whose testimony would be recorded by the Nebraska State Historical Society, said it plainest. Her dugout was so warm during the blizzard of 1888 that they sat inside and let the fire go out. Edna had done the same. She had let the fire dies to coals and trusted the walls, and the walls had held. Oscar Brandt came to her door in late January. He had spent the 2 weeks since the blizzard helping neighbors dig out, attending funerals, surveying damage across the county. He had seen 3 frame houses that nearly killed their occupants. He had helped bury 2 children who had frozen in a schoolhouse that could not keep out the wind. He had walked the prairie and counted the cost of a single night. He rode up to Edna's claim, expecting to find her gone or dead or broken. He found smoke rising from a chimney. The sod house was half buried in drifted snow, but unmistakably occupied. Unmistakably alive. He dismounted and dug through the drift to reach the door. Edna opened it. She was thin. Thinner than she had been in August. Her face was drawn and her hands were scarred, and her back was bent in a way that it had not been bent 5 months ago. But she was alive. And behind her, Rudy and Lenny were playing on the dirt floor, their voices the ordinary noise of children who had survived something they were too young to understand. Oscar stepped inside. He felt the warmth. He had built frame houses. He had dismissed sod construction as something for the desperate and the poor. He had told this woman to her face that her grandchildren would freeze in her half-built hovel. He touched the wall, cool but not cold. 40 degrees maybe, comfortable. I built 3 houses with crews of good men, he said slowly. Frame houses, proper houses. 2 of them are destroyed. The Mueller children lost fingers to frostbite in the 3rd. They burned every stick of furniture, keeping their stove going. He stopped. The words came hard now. They came from a place that Oscar Brandt did not visit often, the place where a man keeps the things he was wrong about and the price other people paid for his certainty. Your dirt house held. I was wrong. Edna could have savored the moment. She could have reminded him of his predictions, his confidence, his certainty that she would fail and her grandchildren would die, and the prairie would swallow everything she tried to build. She could have let him stand there in the warmth of her impossible house and feel the full weight of every word he had spoken in August. She did not. "Would you like some coffee?" she said. "It is not good coffee, but it is warm." Oscar Brandt stayed for an hour. He asked questions about the construction, the thickness of the walls, the depth of the foundation, the way she had bundled the ridgepoles. He asked about fuel consumption and heat retention, and why she had let the fire die during the worst hours of the storm. He left with more questions than answers, but he left understanding something he had not understood before. The dirt house he had dismissed as a hovel had outperformed every frame structure in the county. The prairie had taught him something new, and the teacher had been a 62-year-old woman he had told to sell her land and go east. Marta Pfeiffer came 3 days later. She sat at Edna's small table and wrapped her hands around a cup of weak coffee and told the story of her family's blizzard night with a voice emptied of everything except the memory. She asked Edna to teach her husband how sod construction worked. Willem came the following week, suspicious, uncomfortable, but willing to listen. By March 6, families had built or modified structures using the techniques Edna demonstrated. She never charged for the advice. She showed everyone who asked, men who had dismissed her, women who had pitied her, neighbors who had expected her to fail. "No one should lose a child to cold," Edna said, "when the prairie gives you everything you need to stay warm." Elroy Tate never came to the claim. His silence was its own form of acknowledgement. Edna Hargrove proved up her claim in 1892, fulfilling the 5-year residency requirement of the Homestead Act. She never remarried. Raymond Hargrove, wherever he had gone, had no claim on what she had built. The law said the land belonged to the person who had improved it, lived on it, survived on it. That person was Edna. Rudy and Lenny grew up on the homestead. They learned to read and write in English skills their grandmother never fully mastered. They walked to the schoolhouse that had been rebuilt after the blizzard crossing the same prairie. that had nearly killed them, carrying lunches Edna packed each morning. She built a frame house in 1896 when she could finally afford lumber. A proper house with glass windows and wooden floors and walls that did not grow grass in the spring. But she never tore down the sod house. It stood for 20 years after the blizzard. Storage shed, chicken coop. Reminder. Before the walls came down, Edna kept one brick. 50 pounds of Nebraska earth. Roots still visible after 2 decades grass, long dead, but still woven through the soil like thread through cloth. She placed it on the mantle of the frame house she lived in now, beside the window that looked out over the claim she had saved. Visitors sometimes asked what it was. Edna never told them. She did not need to explain. She knew what those walls had done, what they had held, what they had meant. She knew the weight of the brick and the weight of what it represented. The prairie had tried to kill her. She had answered with earth and grass and 2 feet of silence that the wind could not break. That was the story. That was enough. Edna Hargrove died in 1907. She was 82 years old. The brick remained on the mantle. The land remained in the family. The walls by then had returned to the earth they came from. But the story remained, passed from Rudy to his children, from Lenny to hers, told in kitchens and on porches and around tables where families gathered and remembered the woman who built a house for $2.60 and survived the worst night in the history of the Great Plains. Not because she was brave, though she was brave, not because she was strong, though she was strong, but because she understood something that Oscar Brandt and Elroy Tate and every man who had predicted her failure did not understand. The earth holds what you give it, and it gives back what you need, if you trust it, if you listen, if you are willing to build your life from the ground itself with your own hands, brick by brick, course by course, wall by wall, until the walls are thick enough to hold everything that matters, and the wind cannot get in, and the cold cannot get through. And the silence inside is warm. 2 feet of silence. That was all she needed. That was everything.